I want to spend some time talking about the left, because
Sure.
one of the things we really do on my channel is we spend hours and hours and hours every week watching real Marxist and socialist training, the farthest of the far left that I can find. I have done like more Abolish the Family coverage than like anyone else on the internet. That's a whole crazy world. And what I want to just get your feedback on is, I have some very distinct ideas, and my chat and my audience have very distinct ideas about what the Marxist left believes. And I just want to get your kind of feedback on it, because you've lived in this world as well. And
Yeah.
I think that like the right thinks they understand the left, but they really don't. It's like it's slightly twisted, and they don't really understand what the driving motivations are behind what the left is doing, what they're doing. What do you think about just like that basic premise?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the reason the right doesn't understand the left is it doesn't understand itself. But yeah, I don't think they get the underlying premises. They're assuming a kind of set of agreed upon rules and sort of protocols that don't exist. And they just I don't think they get like the underlying premises of like you know, the utter insignificance of the individual with reference to the collective.
Yes.
The sense that they are radical by virtue of the fact that they are in a pack. In fact, I've argued and I've speculated that perhaps this is the real object, is collectivism itself. That, you know, the left usually figures things like this: we're collective, so we can take mass action to change the world. But I think the cause is actually the effect. We are collectivists, and that's why we collect. And that's why we travel in intellectual, if you can call it that, ideological packs. You know, we're an ideological pack. And that's a couple things that come to mind, but I'm sure you have more specific ideas.
Yeah. So let me go through some of the basic, and one of the things I really tried to do is I try to drill down what the left believes to the most simple, basic possible terms that I can. So we'll start off with the primary goal of the far left is to abolish capitalism, which they define as private property ownership. Agree? Is that right?
Yeah, I agree. That's absolutely correct. That's what Marx said. That's what they're saying. They believe in the abolition of private property.
Okay.
And they want to abolish capitalism.
And the reason they want to abolish capitalism, which they define as private property, is because they believe that capitalism is responsible for basically every single problem in our society. They believe capitalism created slavery, which created systemic racism. They believe that capitalism created climate change. They believe that capitalism created the gender binary by putting women in the home and men in the workplace, giving men all the power.
Yeah.
Am I wrong about any of that?
No, that's all right. I mean, absolutely. Recap a couple things there. I got a little bit of a cold, so that's
okay. That's okay. The reason that the left wants to abolish capitalism is that they believe that capitalism is responsible for every single problem. They believe everything. They believe it created systemic racism because slavery only existed in the United States because of capitalism, because slavery is about private property ownership. They believe we can't get rid of systemic racism until we get rid of capitalism.
Right.
They believe it created climate change because the profit motives of businesses drove the decisions that caused climate change in the first place. And they believe that capitalism created the patriarchy or the gender binary by putting women in the home. Am I right?
That's all true. Yes, they do. They ascribe to it everything. I would add a couple other things. They believe that capitalism is responsible for so-called imperialism.
Yep.
They think that capitalism is responsible for wealth disparities, of course. They think that wealth disparities in and of themselves are necessarily an evil. They think that equality in all regards is an absolute premium, even though they accept, you know, massive divisions between their leaders and their masses always. But yeah, these are all true. And they think that climate change, I think that's what they're hitching their wagon to a lot right now. Because they haven't, you know, so by now capitalism was supposed to self-implode and it hasn't. First of all, they define capitalism wrong. They think that they think capitalism is really what is happening right now. What it isn't. We don't even have a capitalist system. We have a corporatist collusion here between the state and these corporations, which props them up as monopolies. And it's the state that's the problem, not the capitalist class, as it were. This is what they think. The capitalist class is the ruling class, even though no capitalist really can force you, except Pfizer and Moderna, I guess, to buy their products, whereas the state robs you on a daily basis against your will and without any contract, whether explicit or implicit.
Yeah. And I think that that's true. And that's why I really make sure to like emphasize to people, like like what the real definition of capitalism and what's going on in the US is not what I'm interested in for like this conversation. It's that it's important that people understand that they define capitalism as private property ownership.
Right.
And whether or not that's grounded in reality is another discussion to have.
It's totally unreal.
Yeah.
I mean, let me just say one thing about that.
Sure.
The absurdity of it is evident from the fact that they're talking. Because by virtue of speaking, just by virtue of saying an argument, you imply that you have property over yourself in order to make that argument. So, yeah.
You know what's funny about that is I actually have them on tape. We did this for one of my socialism streams about a month ago. I have them on tape saying that that individual rights and individual liberties are private property.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, they think that should be, private property should be absolutely, it's got to be abolished. And the reason is that it is responsible for all these ills, as you've said, but and especially for this, for these income inequalities and even wars. They suggest it isn't the state that fights wars; it's the capitalists, I guess. And all wars are really capitalist wars. Imperialism is capitalism, which is a conflation or a misconstrual of economic and political spheres. So that's a lot of the things that they do. Yeah, you're right about all that.
Yeah, so they believe. I've also heard them talk about how they want to. So they talk constantly about how they want to quote unquote smash the state. So people confuse them with like anarchists or libertarians. Right. But then I have to explain to them, I'm like, they want to abolish the capitalist state, the capitalist government, and then they want to replace it with their own socialist government. That would not be reflective of what we think of as government at all. It would be a government that is more about like everything's going to be given to everyone for free. They want to provide free housing, free food, free education, free healthcare. All of that's going to be provided by the government. And all you need to do is join the collective and give up any identity and take your assigned job from the state and not complain and keep your mouth shut. And you get your housing and your food and your public education and your healthcare. Am I right? Yeah, absolutely. They say exactly. They think the state is the source of all wealth. And nothing could be further from the truth. The state has produced nothing. It is an utterly unproductive entity. So they think the state is the place from which all bounty flows, and they want to just get a socialist state in place. So when they say smash the state, they mean overthrow the capitalist system. And like Marxists believe that the state is just the handmaiden of the ruling class, no matter which one it is. Yeah. So, they got that wrong too, but I won't go into it exactly why they're wrong on that, but they are. Yeah. So the last one I want to delve into, unless I come up with anything else, is the nuclear family, because this to me is the most dystopian thing of the entire far left argument. And I'm just fascinated by dystopian things. Yeah. So I think everyone knows, well, a lot of people know they do want to abolish the nuclear family, but a lot of people don't understand why they want to abolish it. So what they believe is that capitalism created the gender binary, which put women in the home to do the unpaid labor of birthing and raising the children. They want the state to be paying to raise the children, essentially, because they believe that the nuclear family upholds capitalism because it is the production mechanism for the future oppressed proletarian worker under social reproduction theory. That's right. They think they use the theory of social reproduction, that the capitalist class is reproduced by the family entity.
Adorno wrote about this in his book about the authoritarian personality. They believed that the state or the family was producing authoritarianism and the very structures that kept the oppressive capitalist class in place. You're right. It creates this division between women and men. It also serves as a buffer between the state and people, individuals. So they don't want anything in between the people and the state. And the family is an institution that has some recalcitrance and a kind of natural resistance to external power and a coercion. The family likes to do what it likes to do, and it likes to make it it likes to be somewhat autonomous. And they don't want that. They got to get rid of that. You can't have any kind of layer between the state and the people, because then you don't have total control over the people. And you need to have total control. And that's because in order to keep capitalism out, you must squelch people. You must squash their ambition and their ownership and all that. You have to have the state. And I forget how I got there, but yeah.
Yeah. And so their answer to like how they're trying to abolish the nuclear family, enter gender ideology, which is just queer Marxism that's been cleaned up a little bit. And the whole idea of queer Marxism is to push back and destabilize anything that's normal, to include gender identity and things like that. This is why we've seen the explosion of non-binary, because they want to abolish the gender binary, because they want to get rid of men. I've heard you say this too. You're one of the only people I've heard say this. It's not about getting rid of men or getting rid of women. It's about getting rid of all gender entirely and creating a world of non-binary.
Yes, and the reason is what you said. If you do have man and woman, therefore you might have husband and wife.
Yep.
And if you have that, you have the family. So the main attack, and there, I think, are other factors involved too, which I could touch on briefly. But the main attack is to totally destroy the very fabric, or the elements even, of what constitutes a family. If you get rid of man and woman, you've gotten rid of husband and wife, and you've gotten rid of husband, wife, and child.
Yep.
So that the transgender movement is primarily concerned with dismantling the family. I will say also, and this is what got my Twitter account finally shut down. I had changed it by this point to the anti-woke prof. But I said that I think the transgender campaign is also a prong in a wider neo-Malthusian population control effort.
I don't disagree with that. I mostly focus on like the radical revolutionary socialists, who I think are different than the Malthusians.
Yeah, that's true.
But they have like similar goals. But what I think is like, I think there's going to be at some point like an epic showdown between like the radical revolutionary socialists and the Malthusians, because the revolutionary socialists, at least in the United States, do not like the Malthusians.
Yeah,
like,
they don't
like
anything Malthusian. No.
They don't. But they have similar goals, which is why they're going to fight at some point. So the solution to all of this in the minds of the left is to usher in this thing called equity, right? Which equity is about eliminating all disparities.
Right.
It's about creating a society built on sameness, where everyone has access to the same resources. No one is rich, no one is poor. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that when they see these equity departments popping up everywhere, like in their kids' school district, there's an equity department in every single school district in the country. Equity is basically code, I think, for Marxism. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Marx said basically that you would have a kind of radical egalitarianism, and that is equality and economic equality, or at least economic democracy, as they call it. So, in fact, equity is, and social justice is too. This is just it's just a euphemism and a new moniker for socialist objectives. Absolutely. So I would say that, first of all, there's never, I would add this, there's never any equity under socialism.
Oh, no.
In fact, it is one of there's the greatest disparities between the ruling class and the masses under that system, with very little in between, no kind of no kind of distinctions within the masses. You know, they want to reduce the masses to equal, but they certainly don't need to be equal.
Oh no, it's like in 1984, right? Where Winston was a part of like the outer party, and like the outer party all had the same stuff, but the inner party had the good coffee and the sugar
Right.
and the bread, and like that's what we're talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the most disturbing things, I wonder if you've come across this. So in my abolish the family stuff, I've people ask like, well, if they want to abolish the family, then how are they having kids? And what I think they want to do ultimately is surrogacy, essentially.
Sure.
And one of the articles that I covered early on this year is there was an article in a medical journal, like probably 6 to 8 months ago, where they're fiddling with gestating babies in the bodies of brain dead people. And I was like, welcome in the surrogacy. And they're doing this stuff with like birthing pods too. And I think like the birthing pods are just like the entry point to like, we're totally effed now. Like, what do you think?
I mean, they think that like pregnancy and childbirth are unpaid labor and oppression. So if they can outsource labor and pregnancy to either paid surrogates or else machines or dead bodies, they would do it. And there's no question they would do it, because this would be a step toward equity in their minds.
Yeah.
Of course, it leads to a hellscape, dystopian nightmare. So they're very anti-natural, anti-nature regarding what constitutes human beings and what do they need and how do they develop and what's the importance of mothers and so forth. So it's just incredible. And they're very cold in their rationality. So they apply a cold rationality to everything and suggest that we can just reorder all things and we can create a society almost technologically and also just like social structurally. Everything is structural for these people.
It's like an assembly line. That's like what it feels like. It's like everything is just like, we're going to do this. And it's just like, it's like watching like a car get built or something like that.
It's Fordism. That's the
It's Fordism. You're right. It's literal Fordism. Another thing we've come across is this idea of like adult supremacy. And I think that this is what's behind all of the attacks on parental rights we're seeing across the country, because what I've heard these people say is they believe children are basically like little adults, kind of like Scientologists, where they're adults in like little bodies that can make all their decisions for them. And they consider right now children, when parental rights exist, they consider children to be the private property of their parents, which it means that it's their job to liberate them from being private property of their parents. And this is why we're seeing all these attacks on like parental rights and all the pronoun stuff in school. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right on target. I must have not too much to add. I mean, the basic idea there is they want to wrest your child away from you and make it a waif of the state. I mean, there's no question about that. So, they want to make your child a waif of the state and utterly dependent and clinging to and embracing the state.
Okay, are there any other Marxist topics that I didn't think to bring up, because I feel like I could just keep going on. I'm feeling a lot of validation right now, Michael. Thank you.
What else could I say? Well, I mean, there's a slight distinction with wokeness and Marxism, and that I write about it in my book. And that is this. So Marxism, the orthodox Marxist view, that came down from the Second International and all that, they argued or suggested that, under socialism, you'd be living in a kind of cornucopia where you'd have to labor very little. As Marx said, you could fish in the morning, blah, 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 philosophize at night. I don't know what he said something to that effect.
They have all the time in the world to be artists because capitalism has been removed as the oppressive force that keeps them working all the time.
3 to 4 hours a day, 4 days a week at the most, and it'll be easy. And all this wealth will be around them. And but wokeness, I argue, has a slightly different, a slightly different thing. And that is to say, And this, I think, falls in line with this kind of great reset that they want to bring about, where you will own nothing and be happy.
Mm-hmm.
So wokeness isn't promising you anything. It's wanting to revoke what you do have on the basis of the idea that what you have is a function of privilege, not your rights, not your abilities. It's privilege, and therefore you shouldn't have it, and it'll be stripped from you. And they even suggest under wokeness that people will live in a reduced state, an economic state, and a reduced level of consumption. Whereas in the early days of Marxism, at least, it was the promise of a kind of wealth production, that workers would have access to this. Everybody would have a middle-class life. Now they're saying under wokeness, no. Nobody should have a middle-class life. So
yeah. I partially agree with you and I partially don't. And let me explain why. So I always like, again, to like drill everything down to like the most basic I possibly can. I define woke in my book as authoritarianism. And I think authoritarianism can exist on the left and the right. I talk about like the woke nonsense on the right all the time as much as the left. And I think under authoritarianism, like I think what you said can be true under like an authoritarian ideology.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think like this idea of privilege. So one of the things we've talked about on my channel is like the idea of white privilege is more about being a beneficiary of capitalism, like having access to the resources of capitalism,
right.
And stuff like that. And I think that the opposite of privilege is equity, because equity is about sameness, whereas privilege means you have more. But I don't necessarily think what you said was wrong. I think we're applying ideas and like,
I just think it's a transmutation in Marxism, where Marxist ideology, as it changes names and transmutes. I just think that now, Marxism is not promising anything like bounty. It's actually saying you'll own nothing and be happy. And that's what you're supposed to accept. And, they'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have a super chat from Kenneth. Thank you, Carlin, and the great anti-PC professor. People do seem to be enjoying the conversation in the chat, Michael. So I appreciate you spending some time with us.